Welcome to A2A Conversations, an ongoing discussion about turning adversity into advocacy. Join us as we explore the power of purpose, service, and empathy, and the resilience we build when helping ourselves by helping others. Now here's our host, A2A Founder Jeff Bell.
Hi there, and thanks for joining us. My guest today is a leading expert in the field of empathy. Dr. Helen Riess is an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, author of The Empathy Effect, and founder and CEO of Empathetics, a company providing empathy and interpersonal skills training for professionals from a range of industries, including healthcare and law enforcement. Dr. Riess is a longtime member of our A2A Leadership Council. And by way of full disclosure, subsequent to the taping of this interview, I have arranged to do some freelance work with Dr. Riess's company, Empathetics. This work is independent of my role with A2A. So it is great to have you on the podcast. You have been such an instrumental part of A2A from the very beginning, more than 10 years ago now. You helped us get this organization off the ground. You've been cheering us on along the way. And we can't thank you enough for all that great support.
Oh, it's such a great organization. My pleasure.
So you're doing all this amazing work in the world of empathy. And I have to start by asking you, how did that come to be? Have you always been passionate about principles of empathy? Was that something that developed in your medical training? How did you wind up doing this work?
Well, there are really two layers to that answer. One is my work as a psychiatrist has definitely deepened my interest in how we connect and how we help people heal from their various challenges. But I think that, the deeper and more original foundation for this was the fact that, like the Ukrainian refugees, my parents came to the United States right after World War II as refugees. And so being raised in a family that basically lost everything and had to start all over definitely gave me a deep appreciation for, the power of empathy and of human resilience, and has informed my work from a young age.
I want to talk about the term itself. I didn't realize until I read your book, it's a relatively new term in terms of being part of our vernacular.
That's right. The term sympathy is actually a pretty ancient term, and it got into the lexicon because very early on, people realized that we kind of catch emotions from each other. And so it was a term that referred to the fact that we sometimes have the same feelings as others. But the word empathy only came around about 100 years ago, and it was brought into the lexicon by aestheticians who realized that we could experience emotions by looking at works of art and catching the emotion of the artist. And so it was our ability to feel into something, not feeling for, as we do with sympathy, but feeling with and being moved by another's experience.
And there's another term that's out there quite a bit as well, and that's compassion. How would you distinguish between compassion and empathy?
That's a great question. And I think of empathy as the input. It's what we perceive in the world around us. By looking at people and perceiving their emotions, we process that. And then the output can be compassion. So compassion is what we see when we say, oh, that person was so compassionate, because we observe something that they either did or a look on their face. But empathy is internal. So you can say, I have a lot of empathy for that person, but somebody else might not even be able to detect that because it's really your internal process. It's only when it turns into compassion that people see something.
I love that differentiation. That's a perfect explanation. Let's talk about empathy as a field of study. There is no question this is a hot topic of research these days. Has it always been as long as you've been involved with this, or is this new?
I think we've really caught an empathy wave, and that's in large part due to the pandemic, where, there was so little personal contact, and people really realized how important it was to connect. There was so much suffering and lack of ability for people to be near each other. And by not even getting together in the workplace, there's a real cry for, does my employer even care about me? Do the people at the top care about their organization? And so it's become way beyond healthcare, a tremendous desire for people to have an empathic workplace.
That makes sense. And it's almost one of those silver linings of the pandemic itself, that it seems that almost by the nature of the way things have played out, we've all had to sort of reconsider what it means to be lonely, what it means to be anxious, what it means to be a caregiver. We've been put in other people's shoes, and that's such a big part of the whole empathy process.
That's exactly right. A recent article in the State of Workplace publication said that 82% of employees said that they would resign to work for a more empathic organization. And I think you're right, that when people are that lonely and disconnected, they just don't even enjoy their work anymore. And Forbes recently had an article calling empathy a leadership superpower.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of empathy, because this is what you study. And one of the things that I love about your work is that we in A2A, for example, talk a lot about empathy from an experiential standpoint. Those of us who have been through adversity and have chosen to go into advocacy, we know about the mechanics of empathy from a very practical standpoint. You've researched the science of this, and it's so solid and it's so compelling. Let's talk about some of the basic mechanics. And the first question I have for you is a big one: nature versus nurture. Do we come into this world wired or not wired for empathy? Can we nurture our own empathy? Can we lose empathy along the way? How does all that work?
Great questions. So yes, empathy, I think for the most part, except for maybe less than 4% of the population, is hardwired into the human brain. We have brain centers that allow us to pick up the feelings that other people are having. My favorite example is if you see somebody getting their hand slammed in a car door, you flinch, even though nothing has touched you.
Even when you mentioned that, I sort of flinched inside.
Well, it's one of the most evocative pain stories that you can think of, because anyone who's seen it or had it happen, it's horrible. But it's such an example that our brains map pain, even though the pain is happening to somebody else. And it's an elegant capacity because it allows us to know that person's hurting and I'm motivated to help. It also teaches us, don't get your hand slammed in a car door. So there's a twofold reason why this ability has persisted throughout human evolution.
You use the term shared mind intelligence. Can you explain what that term means and how it's relevant to this whole discussion?
Well, yes. So when we empathize with others, there is this overlap of experience. So if we take that example we just mentioned, if I saw that happening to you and your hand was smashed in a car door, I would be sharing pain activation with you. And in that moment, we're having a shared mind experience because your pain centers are going off. Mine would be activated, but to a lesser degree. And that's because if I were just as overlapped with your experience, I would be focused on myself. But because there's this partial overlap, I can experience and know you're in pain, and there's enough motivation to help.
That is just so fascinating. I don't want to get us off into the weeds in terms of the mechanics here, but you do a great job in your book of delineating 3 facets of empathy. Can you sort of walk through those briefly?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is that empathy is one thing. It's really a capacity that has basically 3 different components. One is our ability to use cognitive processes to imagine and perceive what is this person's life like for them. So it's using our imagination in a thinking capacity. The second is affective or emotional empathy, where we have this temporary sharing of emotional experiences. And together, these activate what's called empathic concern. So we perceive, we think, we understand, and then we're moved to do something. And that is the motivation that leads to compassion, to the behavior.
You also use a couple of terms, in-group and out-group, in terms of our ability to empathize with other people. And this is such a key point. Let's talk a little bit about what you mean by in-group versus out-group and why that's relevant as well.
Well, we live in an incredibly interconnected world where right now we're talking across the continent, the North American continent. When the human brain was evolving, people rarely saw people that didn't look like themselves. People were separated by rivers, mountains, oceans. And so they learned that if someone looked foreign, that they first had to be afraid that they were going to steal resources or attack. And so, unfortunately, our brain is still wired for difference. And we're when we see people who look like us and act like us and believe the way we believe, we're calm and we're receptive. But this initial reaction to group people who are not like us as other is actually really getting in the way of our shared humanity today.
Which sort of brings us back to this whole notion of adversity-driven advocacy, the idea that if I share my story, I can help other people kind of move into that in-group from the out-group environment.
Exactly. And that feeling that I'm not the only one, that, oh, your child has Crohn's disease too. I thought I was alone with this, with this problem. Or you're hearing now a lot about student loan debt, where people have felt so ashamed of the magnitude of their debt. And then they find out somebody they know is like, oh, you too? Which is you too.
You too.
And it makes people feel more like we're in this together and less like they're some individual freak for having so much debt. And it brings people together.
One of the studies that you reference in your book that I found absolutely fascinating, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, so correct me if I've got this wrong here, but researchers looked at the ability of literature, characters in literature, to help us become more empathetic. And I found that fascinating. If I read a story about somebody dealing with a personal challenge that I have not experienced, but the writing is compelling enough that I can get inside the mind of that character, that helps me move into that in-group as well. That's wild.
It's incredibly powerful. And it's why, there's such a strong push for the medical humanities now, that we don't just want to get people who know biochemistry and how drugs work and how receptors pick up, medicines, but we want people to have read, what is it like to be a patient? What is it like to struggle with an illness? Because when we get into the mind of a character, it's the same as really getting to know a person with that.
You have developed a tool called the empathy tool. And one of the real takeaways that I got from it was what you referred to as the difference between a chief complaint and a chief concern, that oftentimes we get one but not the other. Can you help us distinguish between those two?
Yeah, well, especially in healthcare, when doctors are trained to take a history of why the person is in their office or in the hospital, we are asked to write down what is the chief complaint. And it might be chest pain. It might be my diabetes is out of control. It might be I can't see out of my eye. And unfortunately, because doctors are so trained to zero in on that physical ailment, they often forget to ask about, what are you most concerned about? And when you ask that question, you're often surprised. It doesn't really have that much to do with the physical thing. It has to do with maybe the consequences, like, am I going to have to miss a lot of work? Or am I going to miss my granddaughter's graduation? Like, people are concerned about their lives, and they want to know, how is this medical thing going to affect me personally? And if we don't understand that, we might not understand why they're saying, no, I don't want the operation now, or no, I want to wait, and it doesn't take that long.
And what's so fascinating about what you've just described is that it makes perfect sense in the medical environment, but it's so true in life in general, right? That we'll complain about something that really isn't getting at the chief concern. I mean, I might complain that it's always too cold in my office, for example, but my bigger concern is I'm not feeling heard. No one's listening to the fact that I've been telling them for a while it's too cold in the office. I mean, sometimes it's like peeling back a layer or two to get to where the real concern is there.
Exactly. And I mean, it's such an important question, you know, like you can apply it to almost anything that people are upset about or complaining about, and to get what's beneath this. Let's talk about why this is so disturbing, annoying, or unpleasant.
One thing that really resonated for me when I was rereading the book, The Empathy Effect, is you write, all parties are equally enriched through this tool. And I kept thinking to myself, that's another way of saying we help ourselves by helping others, which of course is what A2A is all about. How do I help myself by being more empathetic with others?
Just like we talked about, empathy helps us experience other people's pain and suffering through these pain matrices. The act of compassion hits our dopamine, our reward system. So when we help somebody else, we feel good. It's like a reinforced loop. So we help ourselves because, you know, if you've helped a homeless person, like get a sandwich or help an old person cross the street or just do something, they're so grateful. But the good feeling is in yourself too. So we feel better when we help other people.
I want to talk about a couple of challenges around empathy for people who do this kind of work that we like to do through A2A, which is adversity-driven advocacy. There is a term, I've heard you use it, and it's called compassion fatigue. What are we talking about with that? And why is that so important for people who are doing personal advocacy to be aware of that?
You know, that is a very strange term because it's really exhaustion and depletion, but it's not caused by compassion. It's caused by not having your own reservoir filled. Because what we just said is when we show compassion, we actually get a hit of a good feeling. But when we are drained and exhausted and people make demands on us, we feel like we have nothing left to give. And so the antidote to that is not to stop being compassionate. The antidote to that is self-empathy. And that is the name of the last chapter in my book. Some people say it should have been the first chapter because the way we treat ourselves, Jeff, is ultimately how we end up treating other people.
Absolutely. We, again, experientially, so many of us who are doing advocacy because of what we've been through can talk about how it fuels our resilience and it feels so helpful. But there really is this physiological benefit behind what we're doing as well, which is really cool science.
Yes, one writer used the term exquisite empathy. He was an oncologist who was describing how it feels when you really, really meet the emotional world of a person that you're maybe delivering bad news to, and how much they appreciate how you say it instead of just what you say, how you make them feel. And he says that there are these moments of exquisite empathy where the person is enriched and it comes right back. And and I think most doctors and healthcare workers have had these moments where you just know you really made a difference in somebody's life at a very critical time. And it's incredibly empowering.
And then let me wrap up here with this. If somebody is watching right now and is intrigued by the whole topic and realizes that he or she could be more empathetic than they feel that they are being at this moment, where do we point them? I mean, beyond resources, how can they learn more about becoming more empathetic?
Well, Jeff, I founded a company called Empathetics, and our whole mission is to work with organizations who care about people becoming more empathetic and using our methodology to work on a big scale. We have e-learning components where people can learn many of the things we talked about today in deeper layers that really inform how they change behaviors to affect these great outcomes. So organizationally, leaders need to understand that they play a role in how empathic their workers are going to be considering them and the organization. And there are many resources. My book does outline the 7 keys for how to become more empathetic, and it's not just for healthcare workers, it's for parents, it's for teachers, it's for business people, because empathy, I have to agree with Forbes, it really is your superpower.
Thank you so much for making time to be part of A2A Conversations today, and even more, thank you for your ongoing support of A2A. We really so appreciate all you have done for this organization.
Oh, Jeff, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
You've been watching A2A Conversations, a presentation of the nonprofit A2A Alliance. Guest views and opinions expressed in this production are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of A2A, its advocates, advisors, or partners. To watch more of our A2A Conversations, please visit us online at a2aalliance.org.